Rain carved silver scars across Seattle's midnight streets as Brooklyn Sterling's world tilted sideways. Her Louboutin heels caught on slick asphalt, designer confidence crumbling like wet paper. Crimson warmth traced her temple, metallic taste flooding her mouth as two predators circled closer. "Please don't hit me. I'm already hurt," she whispered, words torn from a throat that had commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors. Then footsteps echoed through the rain, deliberate, measured, dangerous. A figure emerged from the storm-soaked darkness, moving with military precision. In 3 swift motions, Coleman Hunter dismantled her attackers like they were made of cardboard. His calloused hands, gentle as they checked her wounds, held secrets that would unravel everything Brooklyn thought she understood about power, protection, and the thin line between stranger and savior. The 2 men crumpled onto wet pavement, with sickening thuds that echoed through empty streets. Coleman's movements had been surgical, strike to solar plexus, arm bar, controlled positioning that made retreat the only rational choice. These weren't hardened criminals, but hired muscle, sloppy and overconfident, expecting an easy mark in designer heels. They scrambled upright, fear replacing aggression as they faced someone who clearly understood violence in ways they never would. Without backward glances, they vanished into Seattle's industrial maze, leaving only retreating footsteps and Brooklyn's ragged breathing in their wake. Brooklyn pressed against cold brick, adrenaline coursing through veins accustomed to boardroom battles, not street fights. Rain plastered expensive silk against her skin, washing blood from her temple in pink rivulets that stained her white collar. This stranger who'd materialized from nowhere studied her with dark, alert eyes that missed nothing. Escape routes, potential threats, signs of serious injury requiring immediate attention. His worn jeans and steel-toed boots spoke of honest labor, but his controlled stillness suggested training that went far beyond home repair. Something about his presence made her feel simultaneously safer than she'd felt in years, and more uncertain about everything she thought she knew about strength. "Ma'am, are you hurt anywhere else?" Coleman's voice carried gravel earned through years of shouting orders over machinery and gunfire, but gentleness threaded through rough edges. He maintained careful distance, hands visible and non-threatening, recognizing that rescued didn't automatically mean trusting. His assessment was clinical but kind, checking for signs of concussion, internal bleeding, the shock that often followed violent encounters. Brooklyn tried to speak, but managed only broken sounds from a throat that commanded quarterly meetings and board presentations with practiced ease. Her legs threatened betrayal as delayed reaction set in, the full weight of what could have happened crashing over her like Seattle's relentless rain. Coleman stepped forward with the same measured precision he'd used against her attackers, but now his movements were purely protective. He caught her elbow as she swayed, touch firm but careful, offering stability without demanding gratitude or explanation. "My truck's right there," he said, nodding toward a well-maintained pickup parked under harsh streetlight amber. "Hospital, police, or wherever you need to go. Your choice." No expectation colored his voice, no demand for appreciation or acknowledgement of heroism. Just practical kindness from someone who understood that trauma's aftermath required space to process, decide, heal. Brooklyn looked at this man who'd risked his safety for hers and realized she had absolutely no idea what came next. The truck's interior smelled of coffee and sawdust, traces of fruit snacks clinging to worn upholstery that spoke of a life entirely different from her sterile penthouse existence. A car seat dominated the back, thermos in cup holder, work gloves on dashboard. Ordinary details that painted pictures of school pickups and packed lunches and bedtime stories. A child's drawing taped to the visor showed 2 stick figures under a rainbow, family reduced to essential elements of love and security. Brooklyn found herself studying these glimpses into someone else's reality, thinking how foreign such domesticity felt after years of measuring worth in stock prices and market dominance. Coleman insisted on the emergency room despite her protests, sitting quietly in waiting areas that smelled of antiseptic and institutional cleaning supplies while nurses cleaned and bandaged her temple. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand explanations for midnight walks through dangerous neighborhoods, didn't question her decision to give false information to hospital staff. Some instinct for privacy felt ridiculous in hindsight, but he respected it without comment. His phone buzzed twice, probably checking on whoever belonged to that car seat. But he stayed until medical professionals declared her fit for release with butterfly bandages and concussion warnings. "You have a daughter," Brooklyn said suddenly, breaking comfortable silence that had settled between them like shared understanding. Evidence was everywhere: car seat, pink hair tie around his wrist, automatic phone checking despite late hours. Coleman glanced up with mild surprise, as if personal details weren't usually visible to strangers, then smiled with transformation that shifted his entire face from guarded competence to unexpected warmth. "Paisley. She's 9. He said, showing a photo of gap-toothed Joy with wild curls and paint-stained fingers. "Staying with my neighbor tonight because I worked late. Mrs. Chen feeds her ice cream for dinner and lets her stay up past bedtime, but Paisley loves her, so I pretend not to notice tomorrow's sugar crashes." Something in his voice when discussing his daughter made Brooklyn's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't identify. This man who'd appeared in her darkest moment carried obvious devotion to someone who trusted him completely, depended on him absolutely, loved him unconditionally. His hands bore evidence of physical labor, scars, calluses, permanent stains under nails that spoke of honest work. But intelligence in his eyes suggested depths she was only beginning to glimpse. Military bearing, protective instincts, gentle strength that could dismantle attackers, then comfort victims. Contradictions that somehow made perfect sense. She knew nothing about him except bravery, kindness, and devotion to a 9-year-old whose artwork he carried like sacred text. When medical staff finally released her with instructions to monitor for delayed concussion symptoms, Brooklyn faced the moment she'd been dreading. Coleman would drive her home to an empty penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor that suddenly seemed like monuments to isolation rather than success. She would thank him. He would disappear back into whatever life he'd been living before their paths crossed violently. And she would be left with nothing but memory of feeling truly safe for the first time in longer than she cared to admit. The thought of returning to that expensive emptiness felt unbearable in ways that surprised her with their intensity. "I don't want to go home," she admitted as they walked toward his truck, words emerging with vulnerability that felt foreign after years of carefully constructed professional personas. The admission hung between them like bridge across territory. Neither had expected to navigate, honest in ways that made her feel exposed and uncertain. Coleman stopped walking and studied her with those patient, dark eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing, recognizing something in her tone that went beyond simple reluctance to end an usual evening. She was asking for something she couldn't name. Comfort, maybe? Or temporary illusion that she wasn't as alone as she'd always believed. "My place isn't much," Coleman said after considering her request with characteristic thoughtfulness. "But Paisley will be back in the morning, and she makes pancakes that could convert anyone to believing in morning happiness." It was invitation wrapped in casual normalcy. Brooklyn had never experienced offer of ordinary human connection from someone who asked nothing in return except perhaps chance to ensure she was truly all right. His house would have child safety locks and bedtime schedules and all the beautiful complications of family life that her corporate success had never allowed time to consider. She nodded before she could talk herself out of it, following this stranger toward whatever came next, feeling like she was stepping into a life that might have room for something beyond relentless achievement. Coleman's neighborhood existed in a world where children's bicycles leaned against front porches, and garden gnomes maintained cheerful watch over flower beds that someone actually tended with care rather than hired professionals. It was the kind of place Brooklyn drove through en route to somewhere else, never imagining real people lived quiet contentment behind those modest doors. His house reflected what she'd expected from the truck. Comfortable furniture showing signs of actual use, bookshelves mixing military thrillers with picture books, photographs chronicling life measured in small moments rather than major achievements. Everything spoke of priorities that put relationships before acquisitions, experiences before possessions. "Coffee?" Coleman asked, moving through his kitchen with easy efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage households single-handedly without resentment or complaint. Brooklyn nodded and found herself drawn to gallery walls covered with Paisley's artwork, watercolor rainbows, crayon portraits of what appeared to be father-daughter adventures, drawings that told stories of daily routines built around love rather than obligation. Joy radiated from every crooked line, security from every bright color choice, and Brooklyn felt unexpected pang of something that might have been envy for this child, who clearly knew exactly where she belonged in the world. The coffee was strong and black, served in mismatched mugs that spoke of kitchens assembled for function rather than aesthetics or impressive entertaining. They sat at a small table scarred by years of homework sessions and art projects, and Brooklyn found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. Loneliness of success, weight of always being the person others looked to for answers, how she sometimes went days without genuine human conversation, despite being surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on her decisions. Coleman listened without judgment, asking quiet questions that showed he was really hearing her, really seeing the person behind polished executive facades that had become second nature. "What about you?" she asked finally, realizing she'd talked for nearly an hour without learning anything substantial about the man who'd saved her life with such devastating efficiency. How does a single father end up with training that lets him take down 2 attackers without breaking a sweat? The question she'd been avoiding, partly because she wasn't sure she wanted answers, mostly because she sensed Coleman's story might be more complicated than peaceful domestic scenes suggested. His fingers traced coffee mug rims as he weighed how much truth to share with someone who'd stumbled into his life through violence and chance. "Army. 12 years, 3 tours overseas," Coleman said finally, words carrying depths of story Brooklyn could only guess at, sacrifice and loss and love that rearranged entire lives around children's needs. "Came back when Paisley was born because her mother—" He paused, something flickering across his face that wasn't exactly pain, but careful control that came from practice managing old wounds. "Because someone needed to be here for her, and it turned out that someone was me." Simple statement that carried universes of meaning. Duty transformed into devotion, military service redirected toward domestic protection, strength redefined as presence rather than violence. The admission revealed layers Brooklyn hadn't expected, transition from soldier to single father without losing either capacity for swift action or ability to make perfect coffee in kitchens that smelled like home rather than achievement. She wanted to ask about Paisley's mother, about wars that had brought him home, about how someone learned to balance lethal training with bedtime stories and parent-teacher conferences. But something in his posture suggested these were stories for another time, shared only when trust had been earned through more than single nights of crisis and unexpected kindness. Instead, she found herself offering something she'd never told anyone. "I've never felt as safe as I did in your truck tonight." The admission surprised her with its honesty, and she saw something shift in Coleman's expression. Recognition, perhaps, of weight such words carried from someone who'd built life around self-reliance and careful control. I don't know what that says about my life, but I needed you to know. Silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but full of understanding that sometimes passed between people who'd glimpsed something real, despite circumstances that had brought them together through violence and chance. Dawn crept through kitchen windows when they heard keys in front door, followed by enthusiastic voice that could only belong to 9-year-old who'd spent night eating contraband ice cream and staying up past reasonable bedtimes. "Daddy! Mrs. Chen let me stay up until 10:30, and we watched 2 movies, and she taught me origami cranes, and I made one for you." Paisley's arrival was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, all energy and joy and complete confidence that the world was designed for her happiness. Brooklyn watched Coleman's face transform as his daughter launched into his arms, saw how his entire being seemed to settle into place when she was near. This was his center, his purpose, his reason for every choice he'd made since the day she'd been born. Everything else, careful apartment, disciplined readiness for violence, gentle patience with traumatized strangers, was infrastructure supporting his real job, which was being Paisley's father in ways that went far beyond biological connection. "And who is this?" Paisley asked with direct curiosity that made adults remember why children were both delightful and terrifying. She studied Brooklyn with bright, intelligent eyes that clearly belonged to Coleman's daughter, taking in expensive clothes and careful makeup with attention she might give interesting bugs or complex art projects. "This is Brooklyn," Coleman said, with particular tone parents used when children needed to understand that grown-up complications were at play without requiring detailed explanations. "She's a friend who needed somewhere safe to spend the night." Beautiful simplicity that managed to be completely true and entirely appropriate for 9-year-old understanding. And Brooklyn felt something warm unfurl in her chest at being described as friend by this man who barely knew her, but had already shown more kindness than most people she'd known for years. The word carried weight she hadn't expected. Acceptance, inclusion, possibility of connection that went beyond crisis management. Paisley accepted this explanation with easy grace that suggested her father had raised her to understand that sometimes adults needed help, and that their home was the kind of place where help was freely given without expectation of return or reward. "Are you staying for pancakes?" she asked Brooklyn with hopeful enthusiasm that made refusal seem not just churlish, but genuinely cruel to someone who clearly believed breakfast was social activity rather than mere fuel consumption. "Daddy taught me his secret recipe, and it's really good, except sometimes I put in too much vanilla, but he pretends not to notice because he says cooking is about love more than perfect measurements." The offer hung in air like bridge between trauma of previous night and whatever came next. And Brooklyn realized she was standing at one of those moments that could reshape lives if she was brave enough to cross it. She looked at Coleman, who was watching her with patient dark eyes that seemed to offer acceptance regardless of her decision, and at Paisley, whose smile held uncomplicated welcome Brooklyn had forgotten existed in the world. "I would love to stay for pancakes," she heard herself say, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in years. The morning unfolded with easy domesticity. Brooklyn had only seen in movies, but which apparently existed in real life for people who prioritized connection over achievement. Paisley chatted about sleepover adventures while mixing pancake batter with serious concentration of child entrusted with important responsibilities, and Coleman moved around his kitchen with quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to find joy in small rituals of care rather than viewing them as obstacles to more important pursuits. Brooklyn found herself assigned to bacon duty, approaching the task with same intensity she brought to quarterly reports, earning approving nods from Paisley when she achieved perfect balance of crispy and chewy. They ate at the scarred kitchen table while morning light streamed through windows that clearly hadn't been washed by professional services, and Brooklyn discovered that pancakes made with too much vanilla and love tasted better than anything she'd ever been served in five-star restaurants. Paisley regaled them with detailed reviews of movies she'd watched, complex theories about why origami cranes were probably magic, and thorough analysis of Mrs. Chen's cat's personality that suggested future in either psychology or veterinary medicine. Coleman listened to his daughter's monologue with focused attention that made clear this was how he started every day, not with news reports or urgent corporate demands, but with complex inner life of 9-year-old who trusted him completely. Brooklyn found herself wondering when she'd last had conversation that wasn't about quarterly projections or market analysis, when she'd last sat at table where laughter was more important than networking or strategic positioning. The realization should have felt like judgment on choices that had brought her corporate success, but instead it felt like invitation to consider possibilities she'd never allowed herself to explore. This wasn't life she'd planned or thought she wanted, but sitting in Coleman's kitchen eating imperfect pancakes while listening to Paisley's elaborate breakfast commentary, Brooklyn began to understand that some of the best things in life might be things she'd never known to want. "I have to go to work," she said finally, words feeling strange after morning's easy rhythm of family interaction and shared domestic responsibilities. The real world was calling. Meetings that couldn't be postponed, decisions that couldn't be delayed, life that existed in glass towers and leather-bound boardrooms, where quarterly performance mattered more than perfect pancake texture. But as she prepared to return to familiar territory, Brooklyn realized something fundamental had shifted during her brief immersion in Coleman's world. The woman who walked out of this house would not be quite the same person who'd stumbled through Seattle's dark streets the night before. Coleman walked her to his truck, while Paisley trailed behind with elaborate goodbye ritual that children performed when they suspected they might not see someone again soon. "Thank you," Brooklyn said, knowing the words were inadequate for everything that had passed between them. Rescue, sanctuary, glimpse of life lived differently than her own. Coleman nodded with quiet acceptance. She was beginning to recognize his characteristic, but something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what she was trying to say, without requiring more detailed explanation or dramatic declarations of gratitude. "If you ever need anything," he said, leaving sentence hanging like open door that would remain available regardless of whether she chose to walk through it. He handed her business card with simple black lettering, Hunter Home Repairs, followed by phone number and nothing else. No corporate logo, no impressive titles, no list of achievements, just name and way to reach him if their paths should cross again. Brooklyn tucked the card into her purse, next to a collection of business cards from lawyers and consultants and other people whose expertise could be purchased by the hour. The ride back to her penthouse passed in comfortable silence, familiar Seattle skyline taking shape through rain-washed windows as they left behind a neighborhood where people hung children's drawings on refrigerators and measured success in pancakes that tasted like love rather than profit margins or stock performance. Brooklyn found herself studying Coleman's profile as he drove, memorizing details of his face in case this was the last time she saw him, wondering how someone she'd known for less than 12 hours could feel more familiar than colleagues she'd worked with for years. When they pulled up to her building with its marble lobby and uniformed doorman and all other trappings of life she'd built through sheer determination and careful calculation, Brooklyn felt like she was returning from foreign country where different rules applied and different values mattered. The woman who emerged from Coleman's truck and walked through those gleaming doors carried something new, sense of what was possible when people chose kindness over self-interest, when safety came from connection rather than isolation, when home was built from love rather than achievement or professional recognition. But as elevator carried her toward 52nd floor, Brooklyn also felt familiar weight of responsibilities settling back onto shoulders that had carried corporate leadership for so many years that she'd forgotten what life felt like without that constant pressure. Sterling Tech Solutions employed over 2,000 people whose livelihoods depended on her ability to navigate increasingly competitive markets where quarterly performance could mean difference between prosperity and unemployment for families who trusted her judgment. The board meeting scheduled for that afternoon would determine whether their latest product launch succeeded or failed, and failure wasn't an option she could afford to contemplate without betraying everyone who depended on her leadership. Her penthouse felt exactly as cold and unwelcoming as she'd feared it would, all sharp edges and expensive furniture that prioritized aesthetics over comfort or human connection. Brooklyn stood at floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over city, where Coleman and Paisley were probably settling into Saturday routine, grocery shopping, maybe, or trip to park, or any other small rituals that comprised life measured in moments rather than milestones or corporate achievements. She touched business card in her purse and wondered what it would be like to call him, not because she needed rescuing, but simply because she wanted to hear his voice. The thought followed her through shower that washed away last traces of previous night's violence, through process of selecting armor-like suit that would carry her through another day of high-stakes negotiations, where weakness could be exploited and vulnerability could be weaponized by competitors who understood that business was form of warfare conducted with financial instruments rather than actual weapons. By the time she walked into Sterling Tech's headquarters, Brooklyn had almost convinced herself that interlude in Coleman's world had been exactly that: brief respite from real life, meaningful but ultimately separate from person she needed to be to survive in chosen arena. The board meeting went exactly as she'd expected, careful dance of personalities and priorities that required every skill she'd developed over 15 years of corporate warfare. Brooklyn presented quarterly projections with confident authority that made dissent seem not just wrong, but somehow disloyal to company mission and shareholder interests, fielded questions with precision of someone who'd anticipated every possible angle of attack, and left room knowing she'd won another battle in ongoing war to keep Sterling Tech at forefront of industry that devoured weak without mercy or second chances. But in quiet moment after last board member had filed out, Brooklyn found herself thinking not about market share or competitive advantage, but about way Paisley had looked at her father while he'd poured coffee, with complete trust that he would always be exactly where she needed him to be. She thought about Coleman's hands, capable of swift violence but gentle when checking her wounds, and wondered what it would be like to be someone worth that kind of protection. The thoughts felt dangerous, like cracks in foundation of everything she'd built, but she couldn't seem to stop them from coming. The weekend passed in usual blur of work-related obligations disguised as social events. Charity gala where she smiled and made conversation with people who measured her worth in stock prices. Dinner party hosted by board members who discussed mergers and acquisitions between courses of food prepared by chefs whose names appeared in magazines. Brooklyn moved through these familiar rituals with practiced ease, but part of her attention remained fixed on Modest House, where father and daughter were probably building blanket forts, or reading bedtime stories, or engaging in any other small ceremonies that comprised life lived for love rather than achievement. Monday arrived with usual assault of urgent emails and pressing decisions, and Brooklyn threw herself into familiar rhythm of corporate leadership with something approaching desperation. Sterling Tech was launching new software platform that could revolutionize how small businesses managed operations, and every detail required her attention. From marketing strategy to user interface to delicate negotiations with potential investors who could make or break entire venture. It was exactly kind of challenge she'd always thrived on, sort of high-stakes game that had lifted her from middle management to executive suite in record time. But as week progressed, Brooklyn found herself distracted by thoughts that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market analysis. She caught herself wondering what Coleman did during workdays, whether he found satisfaction in physical act of repair and creation, whether he went home each evening to someone who asked about his day, not because they needed information, but because they cared about his well-being. Questions felt like betrayals of everything she'd worked to achieve, but they also felt like invitations to consider possibilities she'd never allowed herself to explore. The first crack in her carefully constructed world appeared on Wednesday, when news broke that Lawrence Blackstone, CEO of rival tech company and longtime competitor, had been arrested for corporate espionage. Charges were serious enough to destroy his career and potentially result in prison time. But what caught Brooklyn's attention wasn't scandal itself, but method of investigation that had exposed his crimes. Someone with remarkable technical skills and understanding of corporate finance had tracked digital breadcrumbs through layers of encrypted communication, building airtight case that suggested either law enforcement had acquired new capabilities or someone with unusual expertise had decided to involve themselves in corporate justice. The connection didn't occur to her immediately. Why would it? Coleman Hunter was man who repaired damaged appliances and raised his daughter with patient devotion, not someone who possessed sophisticated skills required to bring down Fortune 500 executive. But as details of investigation emerged over following days, Brooklyn began to notice elements that seemed familiar: precision of approach, careful attention to evidence that would hold up in court, kind of methodical planning that suggested military training adapted to civilian purposes. On Friday evening, as she sat in empty penthouse reviewing reports about Blackstone's downfall, Brooklyn made decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She pulled out her phone and dialed number on business card she'd carried all week like talisman, listening to it ring while her heart hammered against ribs with nervous energy she hadn't felt since first board presentation 15 years earlier. "Hunter Home Repairs," Coleman's voice came through speaker with same quiet competence she remembered, and Brooklyn realized she had no idea what she was going to say. How did you ask someone if they'd used military-grade investigation skills to destroy your corporate rival? How did you bridge gap between woman who commanded board meetings and person who'd eaten pancakes in kitchen where love mattered more than achievement? How did you tell someone that you'd been thinking about them every day for a week without sounding desperate or delusional? "It's Brooklyn," she said finally, hearing something shift in his voice when he recognized her name. "I was wondering if you might have time for coffee sometime. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." Words felt inadequate and formal, poor translation of complex emotions that had been building inside her all week, but they were beginning of conversation she knew she needed to have, regardless of where it might lead. Coleman's response came after pause that seemed to last forever. "How about tomorrow? I know a place that makes decent coffee, and Paisley has been asking about the nice lady who stayed for pancakes." Invitation was casual enough to seem unthreatening, but Brooklyn caught underlying message. He'd been thinking about her too, wondering if their unexpected connection had been as significant for her as it had been for him, hoping for reasons he probably couldn't articulate that their paths might cross again. They met at small cafe in neighborhood where Coleman lived, kind of place that served coffee in ceramic mugs and displayed local artists' work on walls painted in warm colors that invited lingering conversation rather than quick consumption and efficient departure. Brooklyn arrived first, partly because corporate training had taught her that punctuality was form of respect, but mostly because she'd been too nervous to stay in her penthouse any longer. She chose corner table where they could talk without being overheard, ordered coffee she was too anxious to drink, and tried to prepare for conversation she couldn't predict or control. Coleman entered with Paisley in tow, and Brooklyn felt her carefully rehearsed opening remarks evaporate at sight of little girl's enthusiastic wave. Paisley had clearly dressed for occasion in what appeared to be her finest outfit. Purple dress with slight stain that might have been chocolate, mismatched socks that somehow worked perfectly together, and jacket covered in patches that suggested active life lived with joyful disregard for maintaining pristine appearances. She approached Brooklyn's table with confident friendliness that suggested Coleman had raised her to believe world was generally welcoming place. "Daddy said you wanted to have coffee and talk about grown-up things," Paisley announced, settling into her chair with serious expression of someone entrusted with important responsibilities. "I brought my coloring book so I can be busy while you discuss whatever it is that adults discuss when they think children aren't paying attention." Statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact wisdom that Brooklyn found herself laughing despite her nervousness, recognizing that she was dealing with 9-year-old who possessed more emotional intelligence than most executives she knew. Coleman ordered coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Paisley, and Brooklyn found herself studying his face in afternoon light that streamed through cafe's windows. Quiet competence, she remembered, was still there, but she noticed details she'd missed during their first encounter. Way his eyes seemed to catalogue everything in his environment without appearing paranoid, controlled grace of his movements that suggested someone comfortable with his physical capabilities. Patient attention he gave to Paisley's chatter about pictures she planned to color. "You wanted to talk," he said once Paisley had settled into her artistic project with focused concentration that suggested they had perhaps half-hour before she required more active entertainment. His tone was neutral, but not unfriendly, verbal equivalent of careful distance he'd maintained that first night until he'd been certain she welcomed his help. Brooklyn realized she was being given space to define nature of this conversation, to decide how much truth she was prepared to share with someone who remained essentially stranger despite intimacy of their first encounter. "Lawrence Blackstone," she said simply, watching his face for any flicker of recognition or guilt or surprise. What she saw instead was slight tightening around his eyes that suggested name meant something to him, followed by kind of careful stillness that came from years of training in situations where revealing too much information could have serious consequences. It wasn't admission of guilt, but it wasn't denial either. Just acknowledgement that they were entering territory where words would need to be chosen with particular care. Coleman glanced at Paisley, who was completely absorbed in complex task of selecting perfect shade of purple for what appeared to be dragon, then back at Brooklyn with expression that managed to be both guarded and curious. "I read about his arrest," he said finally. "Corporate espionage is serious business. I imagine his competitors are relieved to see him face consequences for his actions." Words were neutral enough to be completely innocent, but there was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning Brooklyn was only beginning to understand. "The investigation was remarkably thorough," Brooklyn continued, keeping her voice low despite Paisley's apparent absorption in her artistic project. "Whoever provided evidence had access to information that would have required significant technical expertise and possibly some knowledge of military intelligence gathering techniques." She paused, watching Coleman's face for any reaction that might confirm or deny her growing suspicion that man sitting across from her was more than he appeared to be. What she saw was slight smile that transformed his entire expression from careful neutrality to something approaching warmth, and she realized he was proud of her for making connection. "Sometimes bad people face consequences for their actions," he said, his voice carrying kind of quiet satisfaction that came from job well done. "And sometimes people with particular skills decide to use those skills to protect others who might not be able to protect themselves." Admission was carefully phrased to avoid specifics, but it was enough to confirm what Brooklyn had begun to suspect, that Coleman Hunter was far more dangerous and far more protective than his modest exterior suggested. The revelation should have frightened her, but instead Brooklyn felt something that might have been relief flooding through her chest. Man who'd saved her from those attackers wasn't just someone who'd happened to be in right place at right time. He was someone who actively worked to create justice in world that often protected powerful at expense of everyone else. Lawrence Blackstone had been targeting Sterling Tech for months, using illegal methods to undermine her company and potentially destroy livelihoods of her employees. And somehow Coleman had known and acted to stop him. "How long have you been watching me?" she asked, and realized she genuinely hoped answer was longer than week. Thought that someone with Coleman's capabilities had been looking out for her interests, felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. Form of protection that had nothing to do with money or corporate power and everything to do with someone deciding she was worth defending. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on Paisley's increasingly elaborate dragon, but Brooklyn could see him weighing how much truth this conversation could bear. "I became aware of Blackstone's activities about 6 months ago," he said finally. "When I realized he was targeting your company specifically, I started paying attention. What happened the other night?" He paused, and Brooklyn saw something flicker across his face that might have been anger or regret. "That wasn't random. Those men were sent to deliver message, to make you feel unsafe and uncertain about your own judgment." Words hit her like physical blow, transforming her understanding of that terrifying encounter from random urban violence to calculated intimidation. Lawrence Blackstone hadn't just been stealing corporate secrets, he'd been orchestrating a campaign of psychological warfare designed to undermine her confidence and decision-making abilities. Thought that someone had deliberately tried to harm her, not for money or passion, but simply to gain competitive advantage, made her feel sick with combination of rage and violation. "But you were there," she said, hearing her own voice shake slightly with emotions she couldn't quite identify. "You were already watching, already protecting me before I even knew I needed protection." Statement hung between them like bridge across territory neither of them had expected to navigate. Acknowledgement of connection that went far beyond circumstances of their first meeting. Coleman nodded, and Brooklyn saw something in his expression that suggested he was as surprised by depth of his involvement as she was. "I was keeping eye on situation," he admitted, "making sure Blackstone's people didn't escalate beyond corporate espionage into something more dangerous. When I saw you walking alone that night, in that particular neighborhood—" He shrugged, but gesture couldn't hide protective instinct that had led him to shadow her movements through Seattle's dark streets. Conversation was interrupted by Paisley's triumphant announcement that her dragon was complete and ready for adult admiration. Brooklyn found herself studying Purple Creature with wings that defied all laws of physics and smile that suggested friendly intentions despite impressive collection of teeth. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it more than any compliment she'd ever given in boardroom. There was joy in every crooked line, confidence in every bold color choice, and Brooklyn realized she was looking at art created by someone who'd never doubted her right to take up space in world. "Daddy says you're very smart and important," Paisley said with kind of direct observation that made adults remember why children were both wonderful and terrifying. "But I think you're probably lonely too, because important people often are." Statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact compassion that Brooklyn felt tears prick at corners of her eyes, surprised by accuracy of 9-year-old's emotional assessment. Rest of afternoon passed in kind of easy conversation that Brooklyn had forgotten was possible between adults who weren't competing for anything or trying to sell each other something. Coleman told her about his transition from military service to civilian life, about challenges of single parenthood, and satisfaction he found in work that created rather than destroyed, about small community he'd built around Paisley's needs, and his own desire for something resembling normalcy after years of controlled chaos. Brooklyn found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about price of success measured in isolation, about way corporate leadership could become its own form of prison, about loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who needed things from her, but never asked what she might need in return. Coleman listened with kind of focused attention she'd come to recognize as characteristic, asking questions that showed he understood complexity of her position without judging choices that had brought her there. As they prepared to leave, with Paisley already negotiating for ice cream and Coleman trying to maintain some semblance of parental authority over sugar consumption, Brooklyn realized this conversation had changed something fundamental about her understanding of her own life. For years, she'd believed that success required isolation, that leadership meant bearing responsibility alone, that strength came from independence and self-reliance. But sitting in this modest cafe with a man who'd risked his own safety to protect her and his daughter, who saw loneliness as a problem that could be solved through simple human kindness, Brooklyn began to consider possibility that she'd been wrong about almost everything that mattered. "I'd like to see you again," she said as they stood beside Coleman's truck, words emerging with more honesty than she'd intended. "Not because I need protection, or because there's some crisis that requires your particular skills, but because—" She paused, searching for language to describe feelings she was only beginning to understand. "Because I think I'd like to learn how to live differently than I have been." Coleman's response came in form of smile that transformed his entire face from careful competence to something approaching tenderness. "Paisley and I usually make pancakes on Sunday mornings," he said. "You're welcome to join us if you don't mind eating breakfast with someone who believes syrup is vegetable and that proper pancake preparation requires at least 3 different types of sprinkles." Invitation was casual enough to seem unthreatening, but Brooklyn heard deeper offer beneath surface. Chance to experience kind of ordinary happiness she'd spent her entire adult life believing was incompatible with level of success she'd achieved. Following weeks passed in rhythm Brooklyn had never experienced before, board meetings and budget projections punctuated by Sunday morning pancakes and impromptu dinners, where Paisley entertained them with detailed analyses of her classmates' social dynamics and complex theories about why homework was probably conspiracy designed to prevent children from discovering their true artistic potential. Brooklyn found herself learning to navigate intricate social landscape of elementary school politics, developing opinions about cartoon characters she'd never heard of, and discovering that some of her most sophisticated business strategies were no match for negotiating skills of 9-year-old who wanted to stay up past her bedtime. Coleman proved to be exactly kind of man she'd hoped he might be. Intelligent enough to understand pressures of her professional life without being intimidated by them, strong enough to offer protection when it was needed without making her feel helpless, and patient enough to let their relationship develop at whatever pace felt comfortable for all 3 of them. He never asked for anything beyond her presence at their kitchen table, never tried to change or fix or improve her, never suggested that her choices had been wrong or that his way of living was superior to hers. Instead, he simply offered her space within life he'd built with Paisley, place at their table, voice in their conversations, role in small rituals that comprised their daily existence. Brooklyn found herself helping with homework she barely understood, learning to braid hair that refused to cooperate with her corporate-trained precision, and discovering that some of her most valuable skills translated surprisingly well to complex negotiations required to convince 9-year-old that vegetables were not actually form of child abuse. Transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. Brooklyn didn't abandon her career or fundamentally alter her personality overnight. Sterling Tech continued to thrive under her leadership. Board remained satisfied with her performance, and she still found deep satisfaction in strategic challenges that had always defined her professional life. But sharp edges that had once characterized her approach to everything began to soften, tempered by experiences that taught her difference between strength and hardness, between independence and isolation. 3 months after that first Sunday morning pancake breakfast, Brooklyn found herself sitting in her penthouse on Saturday evening, reviewing quarterly reports while occasionally glancing at her phone to see if Coleman had sent any pictures from Paisley's sleepover at Mrs. Chen's apartment. Juxtaposition would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier. Fortune 500 CEO, whose evening entertainment consisted of photos of 9-year-old making origami animals with elderly neighbor who spoke 3 languages and maintained strong opinions about proper dumpling construction. But as Brooklyn studied latest projections for Sterling Tech's expansion into international markets, she realized that woman reviewing these documents was fundamentally different from person who'd walked through Seattle's dark streets that October night. Success still mattered to her, but it no longer felt like only thing that mattered. Competition still drove her, but it no longer consumed her. Leadership still defined much of her identity, but it no longer isolated her from every other form of human connection. Changes weren't lost on her employees, who began to notice that their CEO's legendary intensity was now balanced by something that might have been described as accessibility. Brooklyn found herself remembering names of support staff members' children, asking about weekend plans that didn't involve work, and occasionally sharing stories about Paisley's latest adventures that revealed an entirely different side of her personality. Corporate culture at Sterling Tech began to shift in subtle ways, becoming slightly more humane without becoming any less effective. Board noticed too, though their observations took form of pleased comments about improved employee retention and kind of workplace satisfaction ratings that translated directly into increased productivity and reduced operating costs. Brooklyn discovered that leadership based on genuine care for people's well-being was not only more enjoyable than leadership based on fear and intimidation, but also more profitable in both short and long term. On spring evening, that marked exactly 6 months since Coleman had saved her life in ways she was still discovering, Brooklyn stood in her kitchen preparing what had become her signature contribution to their Sunday breakfast routine. Bacon cooked to Paisley's exacting specifications, and served with kind of mathematical precision that could only come from someone who'd spent years analyzing complex systems. Simple task had become meditation of sorts, transition between her corporate identity and version of herself that existed within warm chaos of Coleman's household. Her phone buzzed with text from Coleman. Paisley wants to know if you're prepared for Great Pancake Challenge tomorrow. She's been practicing her technique and is confident she can finally achieve perfect rainbow pattern she's been working toward for weeks. Brooklyn smiled at message, remembering time when her weekend communications consisted entirely of urgent business matters and crisis management, when idea of caring about 9-year-olds' culinary ambitions would have seemed foreign to point of absurdity. She typed back, "Tell Paisley I've been studying advanced bacon management techniques and I'm ready for whatever challenges she wants to present. Also, tell her that her father has been suspiciously secretive about his coffee preparation methods lately, and I suspect he's been holding back some professional secrets." Exchange was ridiculous and wonderful and completely disconnected from anything that might affect Sterling Tech's stock price, and Brooklyn realized she'd never been happier to waste time on something that served no purpose beyond making people she cared about smile. Next morning arrived with kind of spring sunshine that made Seattle's long winters seem like worthwhile investments in future joy, and Brooklyn drove toward Coleman's neighborhood with windows down and music playing, something she'd never done during her previous life of careful efficiency and constant urgency. Streets were full of people walking dogs and riding bicycles and engaging in all small ceremonies of weekend leisure that Brooklyn had observed from distance for years without understanding their appeal. She pulled into Coleman's driveway, feeling sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or competitive advantage, and everything to do with opportunity to spend time with people who cared about her presence rather than her performance. Kitchen was already filled with sounds of breakfast preparation and Paisley's enthusiastic commentary on proper pancake mixing techniques, and Brooklyn found herself smiling at familiar chaos that had become more important to her than any corporate achievement. "The pancake scientist is here," Paisley announced as Brooklyn entered through back door, using title she'd bestowed after learning about Brooklyn's systematic approach to bacon preparation. "Today we're making special pancakes that are going to be perfect because I've been practicing, and Daddy helped me measure everything exactly right, and we have 3 different kinds of syrup for comparison testing." Explanation was delivered with kind of enthusiastic complexity that characterized most of Paisley's communications, and Brooklyn found herself nodding as if it made perfect sense. Morning unfolded with easy domesticity that would have seemed impossible during Brooklyn's previous life, but which now felt like most natural thing in world. She helped with pancake preparation, while Coleman managed coffee, and Paisley provided running commentary on proper breakfast construction techniques. And together, they created meal that tasted better than anything she'd ever been served in 5-star restaurant, because it was seasoned with laughter and shared effort and genuine affection between people who'd chosen to make space for each other in their lives. As they sat around scarred kitchen table, eating pancakes that were indeed perfectly rainbow-patterned, thanks to Paisley's dedicated practice, Brooklyn realized she was looking at her future. Not just next few hours of family breakfast, but years of Sunday mornings and school performances and bedtime stories and all other moments that comprised life lived in relationship with people who mattered more than any corporate achievement ever could. Success would always be important to her, but it would no longer be only thing that defined her worth. Competition would continue to challenge her, but it would no longer isolate her from every other form of human connection. She had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, not just love or family or domestic happiness, but integration of all different aspects of her identity into something that felt both successful and sustainable, both challenging and deeply fulfilling. Woman who'd walked through Seattle's dark streets that October night had been successful by every conventional measure, but she'd also been incomplete in ways she'd never recognized. Woman who sat at Coleman's kitchen table, planning weekend adventures and helping Paisley with art projects, was still successful, still driven, still committed to kind of corporate leadership that required strategic thinking and disciplined execution. But she was also someone who knew how to measure success in terms of Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories, and kind of love that transformed ordinary moments into foundation of life worth living. Story that had begun with violence and fear had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Love story, yes, but also story about different forms success could take when it was built in relationship with people who mattered more than any individual achievement. Brooklyn Sterling would continue to lead Sterling Tech Solutions with same intelligence and determination that had lifted her to corporate leadership. But she would do so as someone who understood that most important victories were ones shared with family, measured not in market share or quarterly profits, but in daily accumulation of moments that comprised life. Lived in love with people who chose to build something together that was better than anything they could have achieved alone.